Veterans of show business said they had never seen anything like it, and they admitted they probably never would again. The Beatles tour of the United States is best described as a nearly indescribable, fantastic phenomenon. It was a display of Beatlemania at its very best or worst.
I touched Paul. Why did he have a I touched him? I like that.
Art Schreiber spent more than 50 years in broadcasting. He was a reporter, a news director, a national correspondent, a bureau chief, and he managed 7 radio stations. He covered John Kennedy during his bid for the presidency and covered his funeral. He traveled with President Lyndon Johnson. He covered every major civil rights riot in America and traveled extensively covering Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he also covered manned space flights. But, he says, the most difficult assignment he had was covering the Beatles on their first American tour in 1964. He was one of just 5 reporters traveling with them, 2 Americans and 3 Brits. So, here is the only American we know who played Monopoly night after night with John Lennon and George Harrison. Would you give a warm welcome for Art Schreiber?
Thank you very much, Kay, and never did I dream that I would someday compete against the President of the United States. It's a Republican plot. I never make an address that I don't first thank the National Federation of the Blind. Now, the reason I do that is 30 years ago last month, here in Albuquerque, I woke up and the lights were out. I was totally blind. And I thought my life was over. And thanks to the National Federation of the Blind, that wasn't true. And I've been able to work, to volunteer, and to be here at La Vida Llena, thanks to the NFB. Someday, maybe Kay will invite me back to talk about how there is life after blindness. But tonight, we're going to talk about, the Beatles. The question that I am asked most, well, there are many, but the one that gets an awful lot is how come you got picked to travel with the Beatles and be a reporter when there were only 5? And it so happened that I was working for a very big broadcasting company in those days, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company. And we had a big bureau in Washington and overseas. And I was a special correspondent, as Kay has told you, and I was assigned politics, civil rights, and manned space. And in addition, of course, I was news director in Cleveland, Ohio, for their big 50,000 watt radio station. I was in the midst of the terrible fight for ratings in the 50s and the 60s in radio. Oh, there's still a big fight going on, but not like there was back in those days. There weren't as many stations, of course, and so the fight was furious and it was intense. One day I came back from lunch and I went by the program director's office and I walked in and all the disc jockeys were sitting around, the assistant, the production manager, the music director, and it was like a wake. And I said, "What's wrong?" And somebody said, "HK got the Beatles." Now what that meant was our big competitor in Cleveland was a Metro Media station, big broadcasting company in those days, And Metro Media was our major competitor. The two of us fought it out for #1 in Cleveland. And that meant that they spent $25,000 to bring the Beatles to Cleveland on their first cross-country tour of America. Now, the Beatles first appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, but it was then that same year that they came back in August and September to make that tour. I don't know what possessed me, but I looked at the program director and I said, "Why don't you put me on the Beatles tour?" And he jumped up, and the rest is history. I was put on the Beatles tour, but this caveat. The bureau chief in Washington, D.C., who I reported to when I was covering any national stories, he said, "Not on your life, Schreiber isn't covering the Beatles. What the hell do we need to cover the Beatles for?" And he said he's got to cover the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And he won out. For the first week of the Beatles tour, I covered the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. But I then flew to New York, where the Beatles were coming to make their first outdoor appearance in New York at the old Forest Hills Tennis Complex. And they were to appear, which they did, for 2 nights. I missed the first night. The Democratic Convention was ending. And I got my first taste of what it was going to be like for the next 3 weeks. I flew to LaGuardia. I got a cab. I said to the cab, "The Warwick Hotel." He said, "Oh, God, what are you talking about?" He said, "That's where the Beatles are." He said, "I can't get within 5 blocks of that place." I said, "Do the best you can." And now, before we go any further, I had all my tapes stolen when I got back from the tour. I had hours of tapes with the Beatles. All of them were stolen, but I did get some back, which off the internet. And that's a whole nother story, but if you hear my voice on the internet, well, you know that is a tape that was stolen from me, and now those interviews, a lot of them are on the internet. This is one that I cherish because this is the wrap-up of the tour that you're going to hear. I want to thank Eric Cedillo, our communications director, for being the super engineer tonight, as well as Kay for all her arrangements. But this is a wrap-up of what the tour was like. And then you'll hear me talk about the specifics of the tour. I did this wrap-up for Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, but other networks, even though they were in fierce competition with us, they asked for this tape, and they were given it free of charge, I might add. And hundreds and hundreds of radio stations across the country carried this wrap-up of the Beatles tour.
Veterans of show business said they had never seen anything like it, and they admitted they probably never would again. The Beatles tour of the United States is best described as a nearly indescribable, fantastic phenomenon. It was a display of Beatlemania at its very best or worst.
I touched Paul. I touched him. I like that. And he turned around.
Please let me see him, please. Please let me see the Beatles, please.
No, go away. Go away. You make me sick. Go away. You make me sick. We stood out there for 400 or 500 hours, and we get to see him about 2 minutes.
Sociologists and psychologists tried to analyze it. Parents tried to put up with it. Police tried to cope with it. No one succeeded very well, except the Beatles. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, known to the younger set as the Fab Four, are young musicians in their early 20s who wear their hair long and their clothing tight. Their 32-day American tour saw them give concerts in 24 cities and gross nearly $2 million. Except for the locale or personalities involved, each city, each news conference, and each concert were the same, and so was the response. The Beatles arrived, stayed, and departed under heavy police guard, more concentrated in most cases than protection afforded world dignitaries. News conference questions were the same everywhere, and so were the answers.
But we didn't come here intending to sightsee.
What did you intend to do?
To do about 30 shows and make some money.
But it was good fun, except when he fell in the river.
Who fell in the river?
Nobody online, you see. You can never trust anybody, can they?
The Beatles sang the same songs in every city, and they performed for 30 minutes. Audiences, generally at or near capacity in the largest halls or stadiums available, reacted similarly. From the moment a stagehand carried the mop-tops instruments on stage until the time the Beatles took their final bows, the scene was that of mass hysteria. Girls by the thousands stood, waving articles of clothing, throwing combs, binoculars, and jelly beans. In Chicago, a raw T-bone steak was tossed on George Harrison's left foot. The sound emanating from the audience was so loud and piercing that it nearly shattered one's eardrums. The noise level of the high-pitched, hysterical screams was so high it caused one's nasal passages to vibrate. Few who paid to see the Beatles ever heard them, but it apparently didn't matter. Later, they could go home and listen to Beatle records. They had obviously come to worship their idols by the noisiest methods available. Those of us on the tour went to sleep and wakened to the familiar chant, "We want the Beatles." Police and hotel officials quickly discovered that Beatlemaniacs would, could, and did go to any extremes in their attempts to catch a glimpse of these British ambassadors of the beat. Teenagers, some accompanied by parents, remained in hotel lobbies or air terminals for 24 hours or more in hopes of catching a glimpse of a Beatle. A handful succeeded, but generally those who did ended by losing control of their emotions. I saw a girl in New Orleans break through a police line, grab Paul McCartney, kiss him, scream, "I love you, Paul," and then she fainted. By some miraculous manner, the Beatles escaped injury. Many of their fans weren't as fortunate. Several girls, and mothers too, were trampled in the crowds or they fell in attempts to gain higher vantage points. The most serious injury occurred in Dallas, where 3 youngsters were cut, one seriously, by a plate glass window smashed by a surging crowd trying to gain entrance to the Beatles motel. One performance in Cleveland was stopped by police until order was restored. The Beatles' major complaint was the makeup of items hurled at them during the concerts. Although the quartet seemed to comprehend better than those students of human behavior the reason for this unusual expression of adulation, nevertheless it did concern them. John Lennon said,
Please, that's all I say. No jelly beans and bits of cake and things, and combs. We've got combs.
The Beatles' tour ended in New York City at a charity performance in the famed Paramount Theater. The following day, they departed for their homeland, accompanied by their youthful personal manager, Brian Epstein, and their ex-press agent, Derek Taylor, who moments before boarding the plane told me he had quit. His reason?
Personal disagreement between me and Brian Epstein, which had nothing to do with the Beatles, who are still splendid, nor with the tremendous success of the trip, which is undeniable. It's too bad. It's life, or show business anyway.
Since their phenomenal tour, drummer Ringo Starr has undergone a tonsillectomy. During his hospital stay, daily medical bulletins concerning his condition were issued, and Paul McCartney has been quoted as saying he will marry British actress Jane Asher. Unlike the screams heard on the tour, they were this time not those of adulation, but those of anguish. This is Art Schreiber in Cleveland.